Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love alongside my co-host Shamika Michelle. Will is coming up the tunnel to, do a grand entrance. He will be with us shortly. And our guest this week is Natalie Wexler, author of The Knowledge Gap, and who I believe is the strongest advocate for education out there. Natalie, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Charles. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I reached out to you because of your most recent piece, but I want to spend most of the time talking about your approach to this problem. But I guess we should start off with that. You were talking about how people should react let's read the title. It's 4 ideas on how to teach in a time of curriculum battle. So you're talking about how they attach this CRT versus anti-CRT, the laws, what people are arguing about, and how they should approach it. So it, like most of your writing, it was really reasonable and an interesting take that we don't hear that often. So can you talk about why you wrote the piece and what you were trying to get people to understand? Because I think it's important.
Well, sure. Thanks. It's important because I've been reading stories about teachers who are shying away from teaching, any topic, especially in history or social studies, that might provoke controversy, that might trigger complaints. And that's especially true in the states that have passed or are considering legislation outlawing or banning the teaching of certain concepts. And when I looked into this, and I'm concerned about that because if we don't broach, historical topics, including ones that are controversial, kids are not going to get a meaningful education. And this is especially below the high school level. This has been one of the problems that has, underlies a lot of our failure to make progress in education. We're not in content. We're not, and especially not history. And so we get kids arriving in high school who have no real background in history unless they've been able to pick it up at home. And that puts them in the ones who have not been able to pick that up are at a tremendous disadvantage, not only in high school, but in life, because they just don't have the context to absorb the information they're expected to. But when I started looking at the current situation and these, so-called anti-critical race theory laws, one thing I noticed was that these laws don't always say, they usually don't appear to say what people are saying or thinking they say. So they're really, teachers are shying away from these topics because they feel these laws prohibit them making students feel discomfort. When I looked at the language of the laws, and I looked at, 3 or 4 of them, and the language is pretty identical. The law actually says is teachers should not teach that anyone should feel uncomfortable on account of their race or sex. And that's really different from teaching about events that make kids feel uncomfortable. First of all, how do you predict which kid is going to feel uncomfortable for what? I would not want to be a teacher facing that dilemma, but you can't guarantee that if you teach about history in an honest, even-handed way, you can't guarantee that some kid out there is not going to be made to feel uncomfortable. That happens, and the laws don't prohibit that. So that has not been mentioned in media coverage of these laws, that they're being misinterpreted, and this chilling effect that they're having is partly due to this misunderstanding about what these laws actually prohibit. And then when you get to the concepts that are prohibited, what the legislators are going after is what they see as indoctrination. So they're not saying you can't teach about slavery, you can't teach about the civil rights movement. They're saying you can't teach that one race or sex is inherently superior to another, or that any individual should feel guilt on account of his or her race or sex. And I just don't think teachers are teaching that exactly, maybe a few, but that's not widespread. So I think the first, idea is know the law, know what is actually being prohibited and what is allowed. And some of these laws, like Tennessee's, for example, says this is not, we are not prohibiting, even-handed discussion of oppression of one group by another, or, various things. So I think, people may doubt whether the legislature was sincere about that, but I think the thing to do is to hold them to the language of the law and teach what needs to be taught in an even-handed way. And if some parent complains because they think that, their teacher's not allowed to say anything that makes their child feel discomfort, then teachers and administrators and school boards need to push back and say, well, no, that's not what this law is prohibiting. Just because your child came home and said they felt uncomfortable about something doesn't mean the teacher has violated the law. So that's idea number one.
Right. And it's important that, like, if you listen to the show, you would find that I'm trying to remember, I don't think any of us said we were proponents of the law. Most of it was either because I speak for myself. I'll let Shamika speak for herself. But for me, I said not even that it was bad. Some of what they were pushing back against was certainly necessary, but I just didn't think it would work because, like you said, the law didn't say don't teach X, Y, Z. It said don't teach in a certain way. So we'll just find different ways to do it. Even for those few cases where somebody is radical enough to want to teach something, they'll find a way to do it if they want to. But like you say, most of them weren't doing that. But it was happening more than I think people believed. They just didn't want to agree that it was happening. So I've had people challenge me and say, well, this law says you can't teach this. And I'm like, I read that, and I didn't read the law, but when they told me, I went and found a law and read a law. And I was like, where does it say you can't? They said you can't teach Frederick Douglass. Where did it say that? I mean, you need to understand the way laws work. You can't just put something in the law that it doesn't say and then say that that's what it's trying to enforce. So I think a lot of it was that. And then that volume from the one side was being crowded out. So you weren't able to really, nobody was looking at it objectively. If they heard in the media that law said that you can't teach anything negative about white people, then people just said that's what it said. Not because I believe my friend, it's because the guy on the news told me that's what it said. Why would he lie? That's what it says. But that's not what the law said in most cases.
And I think it's also getting confused with some, parent activism that goes beyond what the law says. And sometimes, I think it is true that there have been teachers, and I mentioned an example that don't grasp the difference between what is settled, what's an issue that's settled, like the Holocaust was really bad. That you don't need to present two sides of that. But they may feel that it is appropriate, that it is the truth that the laws of the United States or that the systems of the United States were deliberately created to advantage, cis white males. They may feel
Right.
that is the truth rather than an issue that can be discussed, but should be discussed as something that's open to debate, right?
Right. So to be able to say, well, some of them were and some of them weren't, or maybe this or maybe that. There will be, you can't say that. It's just that you have to say white people. But I think the thing that started this, though, wasn't even that. It was the fact that they were saying, they were debating about what the history was settled fact. But then they would say, therefore, I blame this on Nicole Hannah-Jones. The 1619 Project says the whole point of the project, and no one can deny this, she writes it in the project, is slavery. The country was built on slavery, but for slavery, we wouldn't have the country. And that is the reason for everything we see today. So that purposely, if for the schools that are teaching that, which were a few thousand, not a lot, but a few thousand, that is saying that if you're the 12-year-old kid in the class, and you're white, that we're teaching anti-black racism, we're teaching whites did, and so you need to own up to your part of that problem. That's where the disconnect started, and that's where I think it went crazy without a doubt, but I think that's what sparked all of this. Shamika, what do you have to say? What do you want to say about this real quick?
Yeah, I want to say, I don't believe teachers go into the classroom saying, I am going to teach that Black people are oppressed and that the white people are oppressors. I don't think they go in there doing that or with that mind frame. But I do think, and I've seen with my own experience, the activities that they come up with that could actually promote this. I've shared with them before on the podcast that my daughter came home with an assignment. The teacher had played a part from Malcolm X speech where he was saying that Black women are the most disrespected people in America. And so for that activity, the white teacher wanted them to write a letter to a Black woman to make her feel better, to apologize for whatever they had, could have done to hurt her, and how, what ways could they do, what could they do to make her feel better. Even as a Black mother, I was offended by that activity because I felt like my daughter doesn't need to do that. She hasn't oppressed a Black woman. She hasn't disrespected a Black woman. She herself is a Black woman. And I thought about how the white kids or the Hispanic kids in the class must feel about having to write a letter apologizing to a Black woman when they may have never done anything to a Black woman. So I think that the teachers, once I talked to her, her intentions were pure. She thought she was doing the right thing, but it was the wrong thing. So I just think that teachers go in really trying to help, but the things that they come up with are not really helpful.
Yeah, and I think that, we have a big problem with teacher training in this country and teacher preparation. And, that this is one of the things teachers should be learning but they may well not be learning, is how do you get kids to talk thoughtfully about these kinds of issues and about issues from the past. I think there's a lot of emphasis in teacher training on getting kids to relate everything to themselves, and it leads to this kind of thing. Not everything is about yourself,
Right.
and it is important to put yourself in the shoes of a historical actor or somebody who you may not agree with, so that you can understand that perspective. But that doesn't mean that you need to role play being a slave owner or whatever,
We had that activity too.
Oh, dear. Yeah, I've read about that. So yeah, I don't want to blame the individual teachers. It's a whole system that isn't working.
Oh, without a doubt. But I just wanted people to think that I am fair-minded. So Natalie is 100% right that this is not the norm and it doesn't happen a lot. But we got to remember, a small percentage of a lot of schools or a lot of school districts or a lot of teachers is still a decent number of people. So when people, I agree, when people say you're acting like, those parents out there, you're acting like this happens all the time. Those are isolated incidents. They're not wrong. It is. But it's an isolated incident where it's happened, a few thousand times, not one or two. That would be like, like when we talk, really quick, we talk about police shootings a lot, unarmed men. So when we say it's isolated, it's a problem we should address, it's isolated. We're not talking about out of 40 million blacks, 1,000 blacks are being shot unarmed, or 5,000, which still would be a problem, and it would still be a small percentage, but it's something that needs to be addressed. We're talking about 30. So when we say 30 to 40 million, that's different. This number is higher, is what I'm trying to point out. And I usually don't get into too much of my personal thing. Shamika's the sharer on the show, but since she brought that up and you mentioned something about role playing and that kind of things, it happened to me. I had to speak to my son's class because he now keep in mind, in the context, they're teaching, it was Martin Luther King Day. So the topic was Martin Luther King. He came home telling me that we could be slaves. It was like, I can be a slave and you can be a slave. And then we would have to do all the work for free, and the white people would just sit back and go, do, 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 do. I'm like, first of all, explain to me how you got to slavery from MLK, because that was not the 1850s. You're about a century off, right? And so, and what you said is key, Natalie. The reason I brought it up is so key. You talked about it's not the individual teacher, it's the training. The teacher is not some crazy wokey, trying to teach some racial thing. She was like, I get it, but we let the kids talk. And she's like, well, I'm forced by the district to teach this, but I am not trained in this kind of stuff. So what am I supposed to say when they come away with this kind of stuff? I don't know what to say. So even if you're going to have them teach it, you should probably make sure they know what they're talking about. And they're, like you say, in a position where they're able to, kind of temper these things and put some context in these conversations.
Yeah. And I think it's going to be changing the way we train teachers is going to take a long
Decades.
time if we ever get there. So in the shorter term, I think what we need is better curriculum and better materials that suggest, some good activities or some good questions to ask, so that kids are approaching these issues in a thoughtful way where they're actually going to get something out of it. And I think, even college students, believe it or not, get the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement mixed up. There is a video that I keep citing. It was made some years ago now, but I don't think the situation has gotten any better. This was on the campus of Texas Tech University. Some students went around and asked other students certain questions about history, including like who won the Civil War. And you would not believe the answers from some of these students. Like, oh, we did the South. Okay, well, that's at least they had an idea what the Civil War was. But one of these, these don't look like unintelligent young people. They just haven't been educated in a way that enabled information to stick. One of them said, wait, so the Civil War, was that the thing that happened in the 1960s? So,
right. Right.
It's not just little kids. This is a problem 100%. That it's adults, and the most recent data we have on national tests in U.S. history, the percentage of students scoring at a proficient level or above was only 15%. So we have a huge problem with kids understanding our history, and not just kids, because, the teachers are the teachers who we are relying on to fix this broken system are themselves the products of that system. So through no fault of their own, they also may not know much about history. I was talking to an administrator at a school. I won't mention the name, but we were talking about this, general lack of knowledge about history. And she said, yeah, I had a teacher, and this was, I think, an elementary level teacher. I had a teacher ask me what the American Revolution was. A teacher. So
yeah, you know what?
A lot of challenges.
Talk about that. We got to get to what brought me to you the first time I reached out to you when I found out about your book, The Knowledge Gap. And what was so important about it, it talked in ways that most people don't talk, and it talked about solutions, which, was, like euphoric for me. But the thing about it is, you talk about the proficiency being low in history. They seem to know nothing else either, right? So the curriculum's bad, the way they teach bad, the way we train teachers is bad. You talk about this knowledge gap, right? So when you talk about what we do about that, as bad as the history is, we act now in today's climate like history's supposed to be 95% of why we're in school. Like we're going to school for history. So all this debate, forget about this CRT stuff these people are talking about, phooey. How about the fact that we're no longer talking about the 3 R's, right? Or the fact that people are not proficient. We know it. Everybody's study says it. Yet we have a miraculously high graduation rate. So let's talk about the way the system, we'd like to talk about the system. Let's get into the system because you know it well. Talk about both, you talk about the curriculum, but also how we have so many people, Chicago, Milwaukee, Baltimore as great examples. You have a graduation rate of, low end, high 70s, most of the time in the 80s and low 90s. But then you're talking about 11th graders who are reading at the 6th grade level and doing math at the 9th or 10th grade level. So how does that happen? And I don't just blame that teacher in high school, because if the kid is reading at the 6th grade level, that means in the 4th grade he was behind, and in the 3rd grade he was behind, and we just everybody was passing them through, chasing scores and things of that nature. So talk about that problem.
Well, the basic problem is we are sending kids to high school completely unprepared to do high school level work in various ways. And then there's all this pressure on high school administrators and teachers to graduate them in 4 years, come hell or high water. And so, yes, that's one way to boost the high school graduation rate, but then you're graduating a lot of kids who are functionally illiterate and innumerate, and you're not doing them any favors. And then employers don't attach much significance to a high school diploma, and so everybody has to go to college, and then you get kids landing in college who are similarly unprepared to do college level work, and it costs them money. Even if tuition is low, they're going to be taking remedial courses that are not credit bearing, and they're not earning money. It's just a mess. And so it really begins with elementary school, which we have not paid much attention to. We think, oh, everything's fine in those lower grade levels. The scores are better there. It's really high school where everything for some reason falls apart. Well, the scores are better at the elementary level because the tests we're giving don't assume a lot of knowledge and vocabulary.
Right.
And so it looks like kids are doing better, but they get to those upper grades and they hit a wall. And they hit a wall for different reasons. Sometimes, I mean, they're not completely unrelated. In a lot of cases, these kids have really never learned to just sound out words, because we have a huge problem with the way teachers are trained to teach just that aspect of reading. Just, you need phonics. You need it to be taught systematically. And unfortunately, teachers are not getting good training in how to do that. They may think they're teaching phonics, but they're really encouraging kids to guess at words, to look at the pictures. And that works fine when you're reading a book that has 30 common words in it and there are lots of pictures. It can look like you're reading that book, but then you get to 8th grade and there are no pictures and the words are like multisyllabic, then you hit a wall. Right. And the other thing that is a problem at the elementary level, and I'm not talking about math, there are also problems on the math side, but that's not my area of expertise.
Right.
So there are two basic components of reading. One is like sounding out the words and the other is understanding them, right? And we spend a lot more time trying to get kids to develop their reading comprehension, but we do it in a way that is not going to work. We have them practice month after month, year after year, what are called reading comprehension skills and strategies, like finding the main idea, making inferences. And the theory is that if they just practice these things on books that are at their individual reading levels, so easy for them to read on their own, and it doesn't matter what the topic is, so one day it could be zebras, the next day it could be clouds or whatever, that's going to equip them to read and be able to understand any text that's put in front of them down the road. And that's not the way reading comprehension works. I mean, cognitive scientists have known this for decades. There's no such thing as a general skill of finding the main idea. If you can't understand what you're reading because you don't know enough about the topic, or you don't have enough general academic knowledge and vocabulary, you're not going to be able to find the main idea. I mean, it's kind of obvious if you think of a specialized body of knowledge. Like, if I were handed a scholarly article on, molecular biology, which I know nothing about, I wouldn't be able to find the main idea. But you give me an article about education policy, yeah, I can find the main idea. And that's the way it works. So these kids get to high school and they're given a 9th grade textbook on, world history or science or, something that assumes a whole lot of knowledge and vocabulary that nobody's ever given them. Whereas it's incredibly unfair. We're holding them accountable for knowledge we've denied them access to, and we're making them feel like failures when it's actually the system that has failed them.
So, Shamika, what do you think about the fact that this is a problem? She's laying it out in a very clear fashion. She never said Democrat, Republican, Trump, Obama, nothing. She just laid it out. But you don't hear anything about this, right? And while there is a gap, and there's there are bigger problems in certain areas where there's a economic gap in the household and other things. This isn't just black. I mean, the white kids in these supposed better schools are struggling with the same things. I already know because Natalie and I have spoken. And we can get to, the economic differences and what can be done and can't be done. But why do you think both, this problem is painted as it's just blacks, and why no one's talking about this?
I think some people are talking about it. Obviously, Natalie is. I think we have a problem with actually listening to something that doesn't really line up with what we want to believe. We have a hard time hearing each other. It's like even when you come to this whole CRT talk, which I don't like to call it that, but when you even come to that, neither side is willing to hear the other side. Like, I've seen examples of both issues. I've seen examples of the one like I just gave where my child came home with an assignment that I didn't think was okay when it came to teaching her that she was oppressed. I've also seen an assignment that came home that I can see where the left is saying, they're trying to get rid of actual history. When I talk about how they gave her an assignment saying that they came over on ships with apartments instead of compartments, it just really made it sound like it was a Carnival cruise ship. But when I read it, and I'm thinking, this is not actually how it was, and from my children not having a lot of knowledge, I think they they were in the early grades at that time. They had been on cruises before, so they likened what it sounded like to, oh, you know, Carnival is fun. Did they go to the kids camp? You know, and so it's like we aren't willing to hear each other. And so when you were talking to her earlier about maybe her article, you know, didn't get a lot of clicks because it didn't have that real clickbait in it, it's almost like if it doesn't kind of feed or satisfy our feeling of being on one side or the other, we can't really get to the root of the issue because we just want to hear what we want to hear. Obviously, there is a problem in education, and it affects not just Black people, all colors. It affects not just a Republican or a Democrat or whatever. It's affecting the children, and we're having a hard time really getting to the fact that these are kids. They have no affiliation with either party. Most of them don't care about race. And we have to actually fix the education system where the problems start and where they are. And we're just having a hard time hearing one another because of our own personal, you know, we want to feel that, oh, you know, she's on my side or we agree because of this. And that's not always important.
I think that the people are, it may help if they looked at how big the problem was. So the kids are obviously important. We all care about the kids. They think about that. They think about race and they think about the other things. But Will would like this one. Maybe we should look at it as what the implications are down the road. We're dumbing down our next future leaders. If everybody's learning less, then that next attorney, that next judge, that next educator, as Natalie mentioned, is just not quite as good as they were before. I mean, we can look at, you know, they like to factor in race. So let's look at what the average, and we know that Blacks traditionally in America started out behind, right? That they didn't start at the same starting line. But if we look at what Blacks were learning in school in the 1950s and look at what they're learning now, you'll be like, wow. And we're supposed to be going forward. This is supposed to be a massive jump. Forget about everybody who was learning Latin and more complicated math and all the other things. But even these supposed oppressed Blacks were learning a lot more things and learning in a way that they would actually retain it and hold knowledge, like Natalie was saying. You're teaching them words, sight words, and all this stuff. You're not teaching them phonics. We talked before about how that went away. And so it looks like they learn because they're 6, and that, you know, we have a natural intellect, right? And we have a desire to learn things. So a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old will pick up enough stuff, right, to make it seem like, oh, he's getting the concept. And then now you get 4 grades on, and now it's too late because he's so far behind. So, Will, what do you think? Will's joined us. So what do you think about, you know, changing, I guess, the way, my view of changing the way we look at the problem, how big the problem is, to maybe get people to talk about more than just race or more than just, you know, a CRT history debate, as opposed to not being able to read.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of core problems in American education. I mean, like you mentioned, the distinction between whole language and phonics, like this type of thing. So a couple comments. First of all, one of my theories, and something I've actually written about in pretty serious articles, is that after, 60 years of affirmative action and legacy programs combined, plus kind of a weaker curriculum, a lot of our leaders are idiots. So, I mean, when you hear the Democrats and the Republicans go back and forth, like AOC and MTG, one possible explanation for this is that these people are stupid. And by that, I mean, would test badly on standardized boards, have a low IQ. Right. So this is something that I think we're seeing more of. And I believe pretty famously that IQ, test scores, all that, are very trainable. But I looked through Natalie's website, some of your articles, and I mean, obviously, I think the core point is empirically true as a social scientist. I mean, when you say the way to get less educated kids to perform better in school is to immerse them in a challenging educational environment, I mean, yeah, that's correct. I recently wrote a paper on charter schools, and we found a lot of charter schools suck, surprisingly. But we found that those lottery charter schools that use kind of a traditional educational modality, but that also aren't necessarily, hard body Christian schools. There's a block of schools that do really well, that boost test scores by hundreds of points. Tom Sowell found the same thing. And a lot of it's just common sense. I mean, the second part of what you're saying, Natalie, seems to be in that environment, you link kids to a lot of writing exercises, a lot of reading exercises. They learn what they're doing This seems like one of those basic truths that comes up every so often in social science. One of the things we find is that very often people say sort of unpopular but obvious things. John Lott said that neighborhoods where homeowners have guns and you have a decent number of good cops on the street have a low rate of crime. It seems plausible to me. Freakonomics pointed out that things like abortion lower the crime rate, whether or not we like to discuss that. I think the thing that might be most closely analogous, John Ogbu found out that a big part of the explanation for why black kids, and for that matter, Southern white kids, struggle in school is that they study less. So that to me is just, there's an entire, he studied the Shaker Heights academic district for, you guys might correct me, but a year or two. And that was a big source of the problem. Studying was seen as acting white. The black kids in the district were actually very popular and spent a lot of time focused on sports, as did their white buddies, but that took them out of the classroom. So, a lot of this just seems to be, it's very well written. It's a good summary of the issue. But yeah, I would say that's obviously the case. The way to get people to do better in school is to focus on teaching them, reading, writing, arithmetic for long periods every day.
Right. I want to go back to Natalie, but I want to add one more piece, Natalie. When we talked before about how there being a clear difference between the kids coming into school. So we've been talking about schools and all that, but some of the kids are at a deficit of other kids when they start kindergarten. And a lot of that has to do with number of books, parents reading to them and all that kind of stuff. So when we talk about policy and the things we can do to fix this, a lot of people turn to government. What laws can we put in and all that kind of stuff? But you can't really pass a law that say read to your kids for an hour and a half a day.
Right. And I think, it's great for parents to read to their kids, and not just read to them, but engage them in dialogue.
Right.
Some parents are going to be better able to do that than others. They may have more time, but also more education, and they're just going to naturally use more elevated, more academic vocabulary, and kids are going to their kids are going to naturally and effortlessly pick up that vocabulary. I would like to, and that is part of reading. So I would like to just respond to Will's point about, let's get back to these basics, reading, writing, arithmetic. They're not as basic as you may think, because reading, when you talk about reading comprehension, brings in everything we know, history, science, what's going on in the world. So you can't, I think one of the problems that we're now paying the price for is that we have thought we just need to teach reading, writing. We really don't teach writing, reading and math, because those are the quote unquote tested subjects. But if you don't have knowledge of the topic or a critical mass of academic knowledge and vocabulary, and you are handed a standardized reading test and you cannot understand the passages on that reading test because of that lack of background knowledge, you're not going to do well on that reading test, no matter how much you've practiced those quote-unquote skills that the reading comprehension test is purporting to be measuring. So I think one of our real basic problems is that narrow way we've construed reading.
Sure. Actually, just as a very quick response, I agree with that. But I think, like, reading through your website and through probably 2 or 3 dozen others for the charter paper, there are ways of teaching reading, whether you're talking about phonics, you're talking about sophisticated comprehension that includes writing, which seems to be a big part of your focus, that work. So I guess my point is just we should look to actual professionals in the field. We should find out what works, and we should then do that in the schools. So I tend to have kind of a KIPP schools or Semmelweis, the germ theorist, sort of approach to research. Like, my question would be, what works? And you can generally empirically test that, run the regression model or whatever. There's a lot of theory in social science, like how kids should learn or why black kids can't learn in this institutionally oppressive society and so on. And a lot of that is just useless. So I guess my point would be not that reading is incredibly simple, but just figure out what works. A lot of what you say sounds quite empirical, and then do it. I've got a cat here, Bill.
I also wish that parents, especially, I noticed this in black parents, of course, because that's who I'm around the most, approach education differently. So I can say with my own experience, I had a daughter who played basketball from the time she was 9 years old through high school. Very, very smart, always made the honor roll, great grades. Well, her father and I, we had a difference of opinion. In high school, she wasn't playing basketball to the level that he wanted her to, and thought we need to change high school so that she can, get more ball time, or, maybe go to school on a basketball scholarship. She's 5'3". So I was like, we're not switching schools for her to play basketball, and she's 5'3", when she is in the Honor Society, she's in the IB program, she's going to go to school on an academic scholarship, and graduated with a 4.3. The idea of how we see education, we don't even really value it the way that we should. And I was talking to another parent who has a child that's 3. Already, this parent was talking about, the sports that maybe this child will be able to play. And I'm noticing the child can't even talk. At 3, this child should be really having really good conversations at this age, and you can barely understand the words that the child is trying to say. So obviously there's some type of issue. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's speech. I don't know if they can't hear properly in order to repeat the words back, but there's something there, and the parents are completely glossing over it, trying to decide what sports they may,
But he's got a great post game.
Right. And so it's like we don't even approach education as seriously as we should. And I see this even in adults when I see that they don't know the difference between your and your. And I'm shocked a lot of times because I'm thinking, like, that was pretty simple, but they don't really get that. And you can see that just in social media posts, how we really dump things down over the years, that you now have grown adults that don't know the difference.
Yeah, and that's been going on for a long time. There was a study decades ago that basically showed that the level of complexity of like high school textbooks had declined, and this was the 1990s, I think. But the level of complexity of like reading of a newspaper hadn't declined, or a college textbook. So we were essentially failing to prepare kids for real life or college because things have gotten dumbed down in K through 12. But I would like to just follow up on something that Will was saying, which I totally agree with. Like, just look at what works and do it. Like, it seems like it should be simple. And the problem, I think, is the ethos, the prevailing ethos in the world of education and ed schools, which, and again, I'm not blaming individuals, but schools of education are very separate from the rest of academia. They're not looking at evidence in the way that, say, a professor in the Department of Psychology or certainly in the hard sciences would look at evidence. They have it's much more, we're teaching kids, our prospective teachers, about how to develop their own philosophies of education. We don't really care that much about empirical studies, et cetera. So that's kind of what we're up against within the world of education.
I'd like to ask you something about one of your pieces, the 7 ways our intuition can mislead us about learning. And you had 7 points, obviously. Point 4 was that instruction should match individual learning styles. And, you talk about these things that people believe that you look at the research and it's not true. And I totally agree with it, but it also led me to another thing, and I'd love to get your take on that. So obviously here you're talking about, well, I'm not good at math, or I need to physically do stuff as opposed to learning this way, or I'm a auditory learner as opposed to this kind of thing. And so that's just the way you teach them and that kind of thing. But it also makes me think, so the CRT I do push back against is not the CRT you talk about. It's that culturally relevant teaching. And it's because, and it's technically most of the stuff is not grounded in bad intentions, or not 100% wrong, but the way they implement it is so bad. So what they're saying is that, someone challenged me on it, and I say, I think it's bad what I see them doing. And they said, well, you don't think it's good for Black kids to see, Black writers read books by Black writers, or have a Black main character in the book and all that. I said, no, that'd be really cool. Totally for it. But what you're implying is but for Blacks can't learn. So what you're saying is Blacks are behind in math because when you give them the math word problem, it says Jake and John, and it doesn't say, Tyrone and Shaquitha, right? And they're like, well, that's the reason why you don't get it. And it's like, well, one, that's not true. You can still learn the math problem regardless. And that's not the only way black names. I mean, we have a Charles and a Wilford here. I mean, we got a Shamika, but we got a Charles and a Wilford here. So it's not like every black person has some stereotypical black name. And that's what they're trying to say, that that's the only way they can learn it.
Well, I hear what you're saying. I think it's not just about black kids. I think this is an outgrowth of this assumption that the reason kids learn is if they're engaged. Now, it is true that if they're not engaged, they won't learn. But it just because they're engaged doesn't mean they are learning. And that's what teachers think, have been trained to think. And so if you think the explanation for why white kids on average do better than black kids on average is because they're more engaged. And you might think, well, it's because they see people who look like them reflected in what they're reading. Then you would think the solution is, well, we've got to show black kids more black characters or more black names, and then they will be more engaged, and then they will learn just like white kids do. And that overlooks a couple of things. One is, as I mentioned, just because kids are engaged, that doesn't necessarily mean they're learning. And we may not be teaching things in a way that enables kids to learn, whether they're engaged or not. And secondly, it overlooks the fact that there are a whole lot of white kids who are also not learning very well in this country, even though they're seeing people who look like them in their textbooks, right? So that is not the silver bullet, that I think these very well-intentioned educators believe it to be. And I'm with you. I mean, I'm all in favor of having a diversity of characters, and I think that shouldn't just be for black kids, that should be for white kids and Asian kids. I mean, we should all be learning about each other, right? So
yeah, it's not a bad thing. I hate that when I challenge it, that the lazy argument is also, you don't want people to learn about Langston Hughes or whatever. And you know why I come back to them? I say, well, all those blacks from the especially when you talk about the 1920s and such, Black Renaissance and all that you want to read those authors. But you don't want to allow our kids today to learn the source material, because they might be writing in a bluesy type of African American vernacular of a certain time, because they're writing about those characters and they want them to be real. But they went to Columbia, right? They're not. It's not like they don't know who Shakespeare is. It's not like they don't know the classics. So my kid can't read Cicero, but Langston Hughes can.
Yeah. No,
it doesn't make sense. And I could talk about. Oh, go ahead, Will.
No, I think this is a big problem with critical theory in general. Critical theory is useful only if you're aware of what it's criticizing. So, I mean, I think a big problem in the modern academy is that the people who went through that sort of almost jingoistic 1960s and 70s education and sort of rebelled against that developed kind of the feminist response, or, this is the black response, which might have been somewhat valid at the time. But now, if you look at a typical sociology department or school of ed, I mean, that's pretty much all they're teaching. So it's not like you're getting the original quantitative stuff or pro-American stuff and then the response. You're just getting kind of the feminist response, the 5% of the time that should have been spent replying to kind of the mainstream narrative. So that's a little wonky, but it's really notable. I mean, like, looking at education schools, I mean, Natalie mentioned this, but I don't know even how you pronounce this guy's name because I don't take him seriously, but one of the most assigned scholars was the Brazilian Marxist, Freire, is it? My Portuguese.
I'm actually trying to
Freire
pronunciation because I'm going to Portugal in a couple months. I think it's Freire.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, pedagogy,
yeah.
Impressed. The one thing that gets lost here is he was dealing with adult peasants in Latin America, not 6-year-olds, in the United States. So,
yeah,
right.
No, I mean that's a great critique. I wasn't actually aware of that. I think another problem with Marxism is just that it's wrong. I mean, almost every sort of dialectic prediction they make about how people will learn if the system isn't changed or when the system will be changed, it turned out to be inaccurate. I'm a political scientist by background, but I just thought that was just interesting that you're not learning the sort of, from John Ogbu to Natalie Wexler. I don't think you're a person of the hard right. To whoever else might be in the field. You're not learning empirical stuff about how to teach kids. You're learning these sort of radical ideas that are going to shape like how you think as a teacher. And that's very common throughout the social sciences.
And they're openly saying they want to create activists. That's a problem too.
Right.
Yeah.
To go back to what we started out talking about, my core ideas on teaching in the time of curriculum battles, I linked to an article I came across in the magazine published by the National Council of the Social Studies, which is the organization of basically people who train social studies teachers. And there was an article in the magazine that said, well, social studies teachers, they need to adopt a critical perspective, and they need to understand there's no such thing as objective truth. And, it's which is very different from the traditional notion of what a history or social studies teacher is supposed to be teaching. And it was very much oriented towards getting kids to take, uncovering oppression and injustice through teacher-led inquiry and getting kids to take action against it. And this is what social studies teachers should be doing. I mean, I'm not against teaching about instances in history that illuminate how one group has oppressed another and all of that. But the question is, do we teach this as the only truth, or do we teach this as a strand, a point of view among many others? And I would certainly say we should be treating it as one among many perspectives.
Right. Now, lastly,
Yeah.
you were going to add something, Will?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, this is again something that you see throughout the academy. Like many of the philosophies that are taught, or even some of the job qualifications that are out there, are explicitly political. In that, if you're on one side of a two-sided fence, you wouldn't qualify. So, like a lot of my younger buddies that are applying for positions, in academia right now, tenure track jobs as they're called, or that are applying at the executive level in business, they're getting asked to turn in things like, what's your statement on why equity across all groups is good? Like exact proportional representation regardless of performance. Or what's your position on full trans inclusion here at the University of Minnesota? And obviously, if you have the position that 50 or 75% of the country does, like best man should get the job, you couldn't complete the statement. So that under the guise of kind of getting people involved or teaching people about activism, it's actually just a screening process. It keeps anyone who disagrees with you out of these giant fields and just channels, their bow-tied ass back into the business world. So it's actually a significant problem. All this seems subtle. Well, what's wrong with critical theory? But the problem is that critical theory's replaced what it used to criticize.
Right.
Or the statement of activism. It's not optional. It's not for the left third of people entering the field. It's for everyone. So it keeps out everyone not in that group. Blah, blah, blah.
When I was reading that article, social studies through a critical theory lens, I mean, stating that there is no such thing as objective truth seems to be in tension with then what you are teaching, which is that the power structure is, it has been created to oppress certain groups and elevate others as the objective truth, right? But if you start out from the premise there is no objective truth, how do you get to this point where you're teaching that as the only way to look at history and human societies?
Right. It's like you're teaching the opposite of what you tried to say. Then go ahead.
Yeah.
No, I was going to say, I would just appreciate, like when we're talking about history or they're teaching history, that they just teach history. For example, the KKK. If you want to teach, the facts, how they worked, how they came about, what they did, I'm fine with that. But I think when you get into the KKK was this evil group of white people, and they went out and they did this, and it was so terrible. It was so bad. I don't need the teacher to do that. I need you to just teach the facts. This is what they did. And allow the child then to make their own conclusion whether they think that was right or wrong or good or bad. And that's going to come from what they're being taught at home about, different morals and values and things of that nature. So I don't like when the teacher starts to kind of pepper in their opinion of something, because then I think it takes away from that child being able to really critically think about what it is, because you're already telling them what to think opposed to teaching them how to think. And so
I think the bigger problem with it is not even that. I mean, because some things we just know are bad. That's fine. You can tell them it's bad. But what I was getting from what you were saying, where I thought you were going, is kind of like what Natalie wrote about the controversy over mouse. Is that is that not that you're teaching it because it's a fact, but how graphic you have to be. Like I talk about the 1619 project, and I say it's well written if that's one narrative. And in describing it, they did a good job of describing it. But in teaching it in schools, do you need to just beat the horse and let me paint you a very vivid picture? Let me show you every image, spend 2 hours showing you images, or can I show you an image and say this is how bad and describe it and move on how bad you need to go? I think that may be the bigger teaching KKK what it was, teaching how bad it was, and how and make sure people understand just how cruel and evil it was. It's fine, but then don't spend the next 3 days.
I don't think you should tell them that it's cruel and evil. To me, that's not your place. What if I was a member of the KKK and I wanted my child to come and take my hood?
See, there are black white nationalists. They kept saying that they were black white.
Yeah, I don't really have a problem with teaching that the Klan is bad. But I mean, I think that the issue is that all history, all social studies teaching is kind of curated to some extent. Like, I just dropped, for Black History Month, I posted like a black hero every day, somewhat to the surprise of my Twitter and Facebook timelines. But I mean, like, I didn't include Tipu Tip. It doesn't make us look good.
Right. No.
Black generals that famously lost battles and so on got left off the list. So I think that the issue with teaching history that, Shamika, that you're talking about is kind of what you decide to focus on. Like, if you're teaching about American history, it doesn't make much sense to just teach about the Klan.
Right.
And when I look through a lot of high school textbooks, that, again, is kind of what you see. It's like the critical, angry perspective is really dominant. So there's, like, the Japanese internment is the focus of World War II. And they don't mention too much about the Holocaust. So I think that's where it really comes in. Like, of course, you can say the Klan was bad. But, I mean, one, you don't focus on that the whole year. And second, you include the context. Like, we conquered the South during the Civil War and killed like 1 in 4 adult males. And the Klan was a backlash to the white and black troops occupying the region. Like, everyone was committing all of these atrocities because history sucked. That would be the core theme of any history class that I taught, by the way. Women didn't vote until 1920 and all that.
Now, I hate to cut everybody off and cut your response.
Shamika thinks it never should have happened.
But I know Shamika has a hard stop. And I got one more. All right, people have to go follow your Substack, NatalieWexler.substack.com, and read all your other articles because they're good. But the one that I think that Shamika Shamika will really find interesting was you writing about what if school integration isn't the key to education equity. Because it's funny because Shamika will tell you, that's a common refrain in the black neighborhood, especially for people over 40. So it's shocking that no one else knows this, right? I mean, there's literally, if you go to black Twitter and go into social media, there's literally conversations about Malcolm was right. Martin sucks because he's the reason we got to mix in with those whites. I mean, it's crazy. And it's not like 3 people. But talk about how this is another example of how you can't find a solution because your premise is wrong. Your premise is everything in a sense. I know that's not their intent, but everything is white is good. So the white schools are better. The white education is better. So if you send up more blacks into the white schools, then the black kids will be smart.
Well, I want to make it clear. I'm not against integration, okay?
I'm not trying to get you in trouble.
There are, aside from just the sort of logistical and political problems of moving kids from one school to the other, one of the things it overlooks is that even in diverse schools, there's a lot of internal segregation. We don't call it tracking; we call it leveled reading at the elementary level.
Right.
And it's not so much racial or even. It correlates highly with income, but it's really about level of parental education, like what I was talking about before. The kids have been able to absorb more academic knowledge and vocabulary from home are going to start out at an advantage. And in our society, that is highly correlated with higher income levels and to some extent with race. But you start kids in kindergarten on this tracking system where the kids who start out with less knowledge are relegated to simpler books, and the kids who come in with more knowledge are getting more complex books.
And they act like they don't know. Don't leave that part out. They act like the kids don't know the difference between an I level and a B level.
They're very, very conscious of the pecking order. And so you can have a very diverse school, even a very diverse classroom, but the kids are all learning different things, and that's only going to lead to continued tracking in high school where we denounce it. We don't understand where it came from. We think it's all about race when it's really about the way we've been teaching all kids in ways that just set them up for some of them up or failure. And the kids who thrive in our system are the kids who would thrive no matter what. It's not because of the system.
Shamika, last word?
No, I was just thinking when you talk about, or I'm thinking about ability grouping, like I've had this conversation with parents over the years, parents whose children maybe were in the lower level classes didn't like ability grouping because they felt like their children didn't have that competition or didn't have, what could help them grow and actually reach and want to do better. I was always one of the parents that liked ability grouping because my children were always in the higher classes, and I felt like I didn't want them to be dumbed down because you had this child who was not as smart or having a harder time learning, holding them back. And so I'm still kind of like, I don't really know what the right answer is. I just, I hear what the other parents are saying and how they feel about it. And I do think when you are with the group of people that cause you to stretch, you do stretch. Even if I look at just this podcast, I look at Will and how smart he is, and Charles and how smart you are and how intelligent you all are. It makes me want to grow. Like when you all say, we have this person coming on, read this, or they have this book. These are books I normally would not read in just a regular setting. So it does cause me to stretch and grow. And now I'm understanding how this could happen on a lower level with kids and how important it could be. It makes me think a little differently, but I don't know if I would necessarily want my children still to be in that situation. So
let me just clarify. I think, I get your point. You're absolutely right. It depends on what you're teaching the kids. If you're teaching them how to sound out words, some of them are going to need more work on consonant, vowel, consonant, the E that at the end makes the middle vowel long. Those things should be done by, you call it ability grouping, but I would say like what these kids need work on the consonant, vowel, consonant. These kids can sound out multisyllabic words. We should have those in different groups. Or math can be, some of these kids need more work on dividing fractions. But when it comes to reading comprehension, which we spend enormous amounts of time on, it does not work. You can have, the kids may not all be able to read the same text, but the teacher can read aloud a text and all the kids can participate in a high-level discussion because listening and speaking doesn't depend on how well you're sounding out words. And the kids who are still struggling with decoding, teachers have told me, and I've seen it, they often make the most insightful contributions to whole class discussions when everybody is talking about the same material. And what we've been doing is denying those kids who are struggling with things like decoding, we're not allowing them access to high-level, interesting, sophisticated content, and they need it just as much as anybody else, if not more.
Well, I think we've given the people enough to want to read and find out more about you. And a great takeaway I have, I don't know about others, from this episode is that Will thinks our leaders are dumb. Natalie is not against integration, and Shamika is a black white supremacist. So we did learn something. And hopefully you will go pick up the knowledge gap and then follow her Substack, because this is the way we really should be talking about education, not political, just finding solutions to help the kids. Natalie, I appreciate you coming on. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
I got a country to say, 'cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.